Hi, welcome to the Willplex. Come on in. I'm Will Skeaping, I'm a creative director and I'm a serial buyer of books and records, and it's become a problem. It sounds like Bookaholics Anonymous, by the way. I started off doing an art history and Italian degree, then got a job at Google for a couple of years, which was really amazing because they're a much smaller company. And from there, moved into music, worked at a company called Lex Records for 6 years, where we made records, albums, commissioned videos, and worked with a guy called Alan Moore, who was a really amazing writer. And that was kind of a really interesting time, made me think a lot about how illustration and writing and books could all come together into a larger transmedia storytelling, which is something that I'm now doing in advertising. This guy likes records and books. Really into quirky books, and my grandfather Bernard, on my mum's side, was really into UFOs and Egyptology and had loads of really bizarre books about both of them. So I remember from a very early age getting into kind of quite weird specialist stuff. And my parents are early English music experts and really into art. So there's constantly weird, quirky books around me from a very early age. And actually they keep kind of popping back up in a sort of Freudian way that they do. This is by a guy called Enzo Mari. I'm not the only person in the world with this, would be an understatement. I really like everything from Italy in the 60s pretty much, especially art and architecture. I had it hanging over my bed for a long time, and it's a picture of a big apple. And unsurprisingly, I ended up moving to New York. I think I accidentally brainwashed myself to do that. So this is my living room. This is where I keep most of my books and records and other crap that I've accumulated over my brief life so far. But there's stuff from university, there's books and records I've just bought the other day. Really worryingly, there's still lots of room on this Vitso shelving system for a ton more, which is worrying because there's lots of room for more books, and that means I'll probably end up buying them. This book was actually the first one that I remember as a kid looking at and being, oh wow, illustrations are completely nuts. My parents had a copy of this, and theirs is really beaten and torn up, I guess probably because I dribbled all over it as a child. So I ended up buying one off Amazon a few months ago. It's got a few images in it that are really, really horrific and quite striking. These two Dachshunds eating a man's ears, someone about to get their tongue cut off. Always a nice saucy comedy postcard of a buxom wench where you can put your fingers through it and make her legs waggle. There's some quirky stuff in here, and I remember as a kid thinking, this is absolutely bizarre. And one of the images being someone looks a little bit like my mum as a child, and I'm sure in some weird Freudian way that affected me. I think as a child, you're trying to make sense of the world anyway, and seeing lots of really quirky, disturbing images just seems absolutely normal. I guess at a much younger age, you don't really have a sense of what normality is. So seeing a picture of a couple of old people dressed up as infant babies looks totally normal. I remember thinking that was a really horrific image, and that scared the living crap out of me. There's some of Louis Wayne's anthropomorphized cats. Cats dressed as Victorian women. So when I was a little kid, this picture would make me laugh no matter what kind of mood I was in. Even if I was absolutely screaming, my parents could just show me this picture and I'd just be crying laughing. I think it actually looks a little bit like my dad, which is probably why. But I was very luckily, thanks to the power of the internet, I actually managed to find the original postcard that's from. So I'm super happy to have the full colour version now. It's from the mid-30s American postcard, and this one is addressed to Stuart, and it says, "I'm having me a time. Don't you wish you were with me? Coming home Saturday." That's a book on Robert Williams, who did the original artwork for Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction, which was my absolute favourite album when I was 9, and I'll never forgive my parents for not letting me go to Milton Keynes Bowl to see them on tour when I was about 9 years old, so kind of fair enough, but there's some really bonkers stuff in here. I'm not likely to get a tattoo, but if I was, I think I'd probably start here. That's a book called The Cosmic Bicycle. I think it's basically a compendium of photo montage images by a San Francisco-based artist called Satie, and it's actually sort of all related to a weird film he made, which is absolutely awesome with a bizarre soundtrack, and so much of this stuff just, can look really, really current. This is an amazing book I bought in LA by a guy called Bruce McCall, who I gather is an illustrator for the New Yorker magazine, and he does these really, really good, slightly piss-takey, within understatement, images that sort of play on architecture and design and big ideas and automobiles and the American and British way of life. Really funny, over-the-top stuff. This one. Fireblast 58, twice the car you'll ever need, and that goes double for the new four-door fun top. As I'm working in advertising, I think a lot of the kind of time we're trying to come up with interesting, creative ways of looking at situations, and these days it's not just about coming up with a wacky idea, it's about a bigger kind of picture. And with that in mind, this book is something I absolutely love. It's called A Sloth in the Family, and it's about a family who adopted a sloth full-time. So my very good friend gave me this for Christmas one year, I think probably because I was at that stage waking up incredibly late a lot and had a bit of a reputation for being a slow mover. I've always liked sloths. I'm really glad when they became very popular in national press, actually. I didn't feel like I got in there early. I was just super happy because anything that makes a big deal about guys that look like that is super awesome to me. Here's a hungry sloth eating what looks like a frankfurter while hogging someone's bed. So if you're ever thinking of adopting a sloth, I highly recommend buying this book first. I did actually adopt a sloth at London Zoo, but sadly it only had 2 toes, which is very different to the 3-toed sloth featured in this important tome. Kind of don't really have a particular way of filing stuff. Most of this seems to be done by subject or something that's going on in my head, but lots of photo books there. Lots of books about Japanese animation and manga comics. I got really into that when I was a little kid, like most people. My favourite, Super Studio, who are these guys, who had a brilliant idea to combat the problems in architecture and the world by covering the entire world in a kind of unique gridded system called the continuous monument, which I think went on to influence people like Zaha Hadid. They've never really made that many buildings, but they did do a lot of furniture and a lot of cool designs for things like nightclubs and a lot of photo montage. And I'm lucky enough to have found this in Milan, which is a little multiple they designed and made. So this is my favourite book about the artist Barbara Hepworth, who was a leading light in the modernist carving movement, which was a kind of group of artists in the 1930s reacting against people like Rodin, other artists who were moulding things in clay and were taking sculpture and carving of materials back to the idea of truth to materials, that you should be true to the medium you're working in. And I really like that whole ethos. I think it's really important across everything I do to try and relate to why you're using a particular medium. If you're making a poster, think about posters and the history of posters. If you're making a film, think about films and the history of film. Don't try and jumble those things up. I bought this book at Tate St Ives, who have the Barbara Hepworth Museum as part of their sort of buildings down in St Ives in Cornwall in the southwest of Britain. And her studio's in perfectly sort of kept form since the day she died. And it's an amazing building to look around. And lots of the works that are in the beautiful gardens down there are in this book. And if you ever get a chance, get down there because it's stunning. There's also an exhibition of Barbara Hepworth's work at Tate Britain. It's on at the moment and particularly nice. That's a nice picture of her studio, which you can visit. Some of my favourites are Andy Warhol's Popism, which I absolutely love. I think it's like a kind of cheat sheet for everything that's happening in the world today, and you can still find out what's going to happen in the future by having a good reread of that whenever you're short on inspiration. This is a brilliant book a friend of mine wrote called Live at the Brixton Academy, which I think is great. It's about the making of a venue like the Brixton Academy and how that came about. This book is absolutely awesome. It's a classic, Martin Amis, Money. I remember reading that the first time and not entirely getting it, and then rereading it again when I was a bit older and absolutely loving it. Well, let's go upstairs and I'll show you where, when possible, I do as much reading as I can. Watch out for spiders. Two books I really like are this one called Counting Sheep by Paul Martin, which I bought at the Sleeping and Dreaming exhibition at the excellent Wellcome Collection, who did a brilliant exhibition about sleeping and dreaming. I worked on a startup out in Israel, which was doing dream analysis over the internet, so keeping dream diaries, which is something I tried to do for a bit, but I found it sent me slightly loopy as you start forgetting what's something you've dreamt and what's something that really happened. But this book is really, really good. It kind of talks a lot about the taboos around sleep, which are fascinating, particularly the idea that these days we talk about getting 8 hours and it has to be uninterrupted, it needs to happen in a completely dark room, and if you're not getting that 8 hours, you must have some kind of insomnia. I'd recommend this to anyone who has ever slept or is thinking about closing their eyes and sleeping. It's an absolute winner. It's a really, really, really interesting book, and it's got universal appeal, especially if you're worried about insomnia or worried about the fact that you might not be able to sleep. It's not something that's ever I've had a problem with. Great book. It's a kind of overview of a group called Ant Farm, who were a sort of architecture and video making collective from the West Coast, working in the late 60s and 70s. And I'm just really into pretty much everything they've done. The two key members, I think, are Chip Lord and Doug Michaels. And Doug had some really snazzy ideas and died in mysterious circumstances. But one of his best appearances is a video where he goes on Japanese TV and talks a lot about how he wants to open a dolphin human think tank in space, and manages to say with a straight face how he wants to create a gigantic bubble of water held in perfect spherical form by sound waves with a large sort of Saturn-style ring, a space station ring around it. And in the middle of this bubble will be a supercomputer programmed by the sonar waves of dolphins. And together with our aquatic cousins, brothers, sisters, whatever they are, we can work for a better tomorrow. And there's these just really confused looking Japanese news reporters and this bizarre music over the top. It's a really, really fascinating group of people. I don't know how serious he was, but as a kind of thought experiment, it's completely brilliant.
ブルースターというのは宇宙で初めてのシンクタンクになります。で、これは無重力の状態の中で人間が思考するという研究所になるわけです。無重力の中ですね。
Also, they kind of came up with the idea for YouTube and did some great stunts, like crashing a car into a massive pile of tellies in a piece called Media Burn. They didn't do a lot of buildings, and the ones they did were often unlivable, inable, but they were visionaries, and I absolutely love them, and I really hope you guys cover them in this series, because I'm sure they've got some fascinating books.